Welcome to this webinar, Pine Mountain Logging and Chaparral Removal, What You Need to Know. There's a ton of interest on this issue, so we're so glad to offer the chance for a deep dive into information about the Pine Mountain area, the project proposed by the Forest Service, why you should be concerned, and what you can do. This project will impact cultural sites important to Chumash groups throughout the region. It's also a wildly popular recreation area locally and all the way across the country. I'm Rebecca August. I'm the Director of Advocacy at Los Padres Forest Watch. Forest Watch protects wildlife, wilderness, water, and sustainable access throughout the Los Padres National Forest and the Carrizo Plain National Monument. We achieve this through education, advocacy, and when necessary, legal action for the benefit of our communities, climate, and future generations. You can stay on top of this and other issues by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Check out our website at lpfw.org. There's lots of resources and information there. For this webinar, there's two options for being in touch with us and asking questions. The best way is to use the send question option, or you can use the chat box, but it may be crowded and we may have trouble finding your questions, but we'll get to everything eventually. We'll do the best to answer every single question. If we don't get to it here, we'll post them online. I'm really proud to introduce our Conservation Director, Bryant Baker. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in environmental science. He's been working on these issues of fire and forest ecology in this region for several years now, collaborating closely with the forest ecologists and fire scientists that are working on it as well. He's a photographer. We use a lot of his photographs in our posts. You can follow him and his Chaparral loving Instagram account at Bryant the Shrublander. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to be talking about this project. This is this project on Pine Mountain. It got proposed back in late May, right at the time when we were all concerned with the pandemic and the economic recession. And then, of course, at that time was really when there was a lot of protests that were just beginning about racial injustice, and it was really just an unfortunate time for a big project like this in such a special place, to be proposed. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about this. I'm going to be focusing almost just completely on the ecological side of this. That's what I'm qualified to be talking about. There is, like Rebecca said, there is going to be, there could be impacts to cultural sites, of course, recreation considerations as well. But I'm going to tell you today about the ecology of this area, what's natural, what's not, and what the Forest Service is proposing to do and how that maybe doesn't follow the best available science very well. So, real quick, the project is 755 acres in size, and it covers most of Pine Mountain Ridge, and I'm going to show you a map here in a second. It would include cutting of live and dead trees using heavy equipment or chainsaws. And again, a lot of people have expressed this idea to us that this project is just about removing dead or dying trees. I can assure you that is not what this project is about. There's going to probably, based on what we're seeing, almost certainly there will be far more live, healthy trees removed than there will be dead trees. But I will be talking about the ecological importance of dead trees later on. And there are a couple of size limitations to what sort of trees can be removed. I'm going to talk more in depth about that here in a bit, but you can see there's some limits here that are included in the project description. And then, of course, about half of the project actually includes masticating or clearing chaparral, this high elevation montane chaparral, and canyon live oak woodland. And I'll talk about that more in a bit. And the Forest Service, at their virtual meeting last week, they confirmed that this project could involve a timber sale, a commercial timber sale, or some other way that the timber that will be cut will be sold. Now that is an option that's on the table. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but they have confirmed that they are exploring that option. So here's the project area. You can see that it extends from Highway 33 just about along the ridge. It's about a little over 6 miles of the ridge over here to the Reyes Peak area. And the project is actually called the Reyes Peak Forest Health and Fuels Reduction Project. I think it should have been called the Pine Mountain Project. That's certainly why we're referring to it that way, because it is mostly affecting Pine Mountain Ridge here. Reyes Peak very much on the side of it, and I think that may have been sort of on purpose, just to try to not draw so much attention to the fact that this would be covering a big part of Pine Mountain Ridge, which is where a lot of these amazing recreational areas are. You can see there's a lot of trails, a lot of campground, a couple campgrounds here, and if you've been following along with our website post and our social media posts, you would know that about 34% of the project overlaps proposed wilderness areas. So these are areas that have actually been included in the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, which passed the House of Representatives earlier this year and is working its way through the Senate. So these could be added to the SESP wilderness. So we're very concerned about that as well. And to look at the vegetation types in the project area, and again, this is the project area, this red outline here. So you can see that it is a big part of it is conifer forest, and I'm going to talk more about what types of conifers and what types of forest is here. But there's also these really big swaths of land here that are chaparral, or they're labeled as hardwood. The hardwood is really canyon live oak woodland that is more like chaparral than it is like woodland. This is just how this plant grows in that area. And so you can kind of think of this whole ridge line as being very much shrubland or sort of a low dense woodland. And so there's a very nice complex mixture of different vegetation types in this area. And this is my love here, chaparral. This is one of the most amazing ecosystems on Earth, and we have a lot of it in the Los Padres, but we don't actually have a whole lot of this type of chaparral, which is this high elevation, it's montane chaparral. This is actually old growth. It has been able to escape fire for several decades, and this is really an amazing thing to see in this area. You just don't find it very much in other parts of the forest, especially where you have this really nice mixture of manzanita species, and there's some California lilacs, you know this, and some canyon live oak, and there's many other species up here too. It's a very diverse ecosystem. And again, this is all in the project area and could be masticated or cleared as part of the project. Here's another photo of chaparral that I took just this weekend. You can see the chaparral whitethorn. This is a type of ceanothus or California lilac. It's blooming up there. It's just an amazing site, and really special habitat. There's also some areas that might be described as sagebrush scrub, or it's mostly rabbit brush, which often sort of intermixes with the chaparral, but it's something a little bit more like what you might see in those more desert-like areas like east of the Sierra, out in the Great Basin. And of course, there is some Great Basin sagebrush up in this area. You'll find these nice patches of it, sometimes mixed in with the conifer stands. This is Great Basin sagebrush or big sagebrush, really cool species here. This is what the canyon live oak woodlands look like. Sometimes they're growing right in with the conifers. Sometimes they're growing as sort of pure stands. Often they're much more dense than this, and they grow right alongside the chaparral. But this is generally what they look like. These are really fascinating oak species that you find in our canyons, especially on these north slopes in this area. So, of course, a lot of the concern with this project is around cutting of trees, big conifers, and the main conifer types that we have up here are really, we have Jeffrey pine forest, or what we might call yellow pine forest. If you're familiar with ponderosa pine, it's a very similar species. Here we have almost exclusively Jeffrey pine, but if you go into other areas like Arizona or Northern California, you'll see a lot more ponderosa pine, but they're very similar. They sort of serve the same role in these ecosystems. So you can see this is a nice little open stand of Jeffrey pine in the project area. And just so you know, most of these trees, based on size measurements, diameter size, they fall actually under that no questions asked limit of 24 inches in diameter, which is problematic. This is what a lot of our mixed conifer forests look like in the area. So you can see some really nice, big, mature white fir species here. It's hard to tell unless you're looking up in the treetops, but this is all white fir. These are white fir. You can see some Jeffrey pine in the background, and there's some sugar pine back here, some incense cedar, a lot of really cool conifer species. In fact, this ridge has the highest diversity of conifers in Ventura County, and there's really not many places like it in Southern California. So a really amazing area, and you can see this has got a lot of diversity going on here. And there is one area that is included in the project area that is actually what I would consider an ancient white fir forest. This is something that you really don't see hardly at all in the Los Padres. You see this a lot more in the Sierra at higher elevations. And so you can see everything to the right in this photo is included in the project area. This is Reyes Peak Trail. These is a friend of mine and my dog and my girlfriend hiking along here and hiking among these really nice big white fir trees that have been there for hundreds of years, and just a really amazing area. And this is exactly what this forest type is supposed to look like, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful area. And again, you're not going to find it in many other places in our region. So let's talk about those tree limits. I'm calling this the no questions asked limit. This is basically what the Forest Service is saying. Anything below this limit, we can cut, and we don't have to explain why we're cutting it. So this is 24 inches in diameter. We call this DBH, or diameter at breast height. So you can see right about there is where I would measure it. And this is me, in case you're curious. This is what I look like when I'm out in the field. And I'm using myself as scale, just so you have a sense of how big these trees are. So this is actually a 23.5-inch tree. So this is a little bit less than the 24-inch diameter limit. And this is what the Forest Service is calling a small tree. So anything below this limit, they're calling it a small tree, and they can remove those fairly indiscriminately. So again, even if they were just sticking under this limit, there would be a lot of large tree removal. In fact, this is one of their target sizes, is right around this size to be removing, and there's obviously going to be some serious issues with that. Now, there is a way for them to remove larger trees, so trees up to 64 inches in diameter, and there are two reasons that are given. So these are special circumstances under which these trees may be removed. One is safety reasons. It's not well defined. We see this in a lot of these types of projects that have happened in other national forests, where basically they leave it up to whoever's doing the work. That could be a logging company, and essentially if the logging company feels that a tree is sort of in their way or may cause some safety issue for whatever reason, they can cut larger trees. And the other reason, which I find even more troubling, is they say that if it's impacted by dwarf mistletoe. Now, dwarf mistletoe is a native plant species that is found throughout the area. It is a parasitic species, but it's really, really critical to forest health. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. These are both reasons for cutting larger trees that really could easily be abused, and that's problematic in our view. So just to give you a sense, this is a 53-inch tree. We actually would measure it at breast height on this side where it's kind of upslope. So it looks like we're measuring a little bit too high, but we actually started over here. And this is my girlfriend Gabby. She's actually measuring the tree here with a special measuring tape that converts circumference to diameter. This is what foresters use to actually go out and measure these tree sizes. So again, this is a 53-inch tree. It's almost a foot smaller than the max limit. And let me just be clear about this. We've been doing a lot of measurement up there, and I have not found a tree larger than 64 inches in the project area. So this limit really kind of encapsulates anything and everything up there is one of the big problems. And one of the reasons, of course, is that most trees in the area have some form of dwarf mistletoe. There are a lot of different species. Some only occur on white fir, some only occur on Jeffrey pine. And again, these are important to forest health. There are some bird species that depend on them. There's a great study from back in the 90s that really looked at dwarf mistletoe and how it impacted bird diversity, and they found that bird diversity was positively correlated in ponderosa pine forest with the presence of dwarf mistletoe. There's a lot of different reasons for that, but these help maintain balance in the ecosystem, and they're really just important native plant species, but they're often used as an excuse to remove large trees, and that is problematic. So here you can actually see this is the dwarf mistletoe. There's some more up here. This is a tree that is well over that 24-inch limit, but under the 64-inch diameter limit. So because it has dwarf mistletoe and because this stipulation is not well defined, this tree could very easily be removed under the project description. And these, again, are important for forest health. A healthy forest has a diversity of live and dead trees and trees that have this dwarf mistletoe. These plants have been co-evolving with these forest types for millions of years, and they do serve an important ecological function. So let's talk about environmental review. And let's specifically talk about the National Environmental Policy Act. So if you know anything about the National Environmental Policy Act, which I will now just call NEPA, that's what we refer to it as. It was a law passed in 1969 and signed into law in 1970. And essentially what it does is it requires that any action that is taken on federal land or is taken by a federal agency that could impact the environment, that action has to go through some sort of environmental review process. Usually this is an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. You've probably heard the words environmental impact report. That's a very similar thing, but that's usually at the state level. So when we're talking about federal NEPA compliance, it's usually we're talking about an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, an EA or an EIS. That's how I'm going to talk about these. So the real question, though, and this was a question that really quickly came up after this law was passed, was should every single action actually require an EA or an EIS? What about painting a bathroom or fixing the ranger station gate, fixing a culvert, things like that? Relatively low impact activities that are pretty minor, things that have to happen a lot. And society agreed at the time that not every action requires such rigorous environmental review. And it would be ridiculous for the agency to have to develop an EA to paint one of the bathrooms at a campground. That would be crazy. And so we, of course, that's not what this is about. But this is where we bring in this whole idea of categorical exclusions. So categorical exclusions initially started out to make sure that those types of small actions didn't have to go through an EA or an EIS. And unfortunately, what has happened over the last 2-3 decades, especially over the last few years, is that we're seeing these categorical exclusions become bigger and bigger. There are more of them than ever, and they have essentially just become loopholes to avoid preparing an environmental assessment or an EIS for really big projects that involve something that can be very potentially damaging, such as selective logging, like we're dealing with here, or chaparral, mastication, things like that. So this has become a major issue. Very few projects these days actually go through that EA or EIS process, which is a very important process because it requires the agency to do certain things. So let me just explain how the public is getting cut out of the process, the decision-making process, when an agency like the Forest Service uses an environmental or a categorical exclusion to approve a project. So rather than with an EA or an EIS, which you usually get 2 comment periods, you only get 1. That's the one we're in right now. It ends on June 30th. This is the only comment period that we are going to get for this project unless the agency decides that they will prepare an EA later on. But right now they've indicated that they're going to be using 2 categorical exclusions and that they, that's how they're going to move forward with these projects. So this is the 1 comment period that we get. Also, the agency is not required under this process to respond to comments. When they do an EA or an EIS, they have to actually make part of that document that it's actually a response to comments. So they will respond to your concerns. They will tell you their rationale for why they either did or did not address them. That's a very important process, and it helps keep the agency accountable, and it helps make this whole, the whole way that these things are done, it makes it much more transparent. Now, the other really big issue here with categorical exclusions, there's really just 2 steps that happen. First, the agency notifies the public, and this is only in some cases. In this case, they did notify at least some of the public. They sent a letter to some groups, and then of course we are trying to get the word out to the rest of the public. But the thing is, after that step, after that comment period ends, then a few months later, they'll issue what's called a decision memo, and that's it. That is the end of the process. There is no objection period, and that is something that you get with an EA or an EIS. In other words, when they issue their final environmental assessment and their decision, they then set up a 45-day period where the public has an opportunity to officially object to particular points of the project. And then the agency is required to actually mediate. They're supposed to come to the table with you and try to figure out how to make the project less problematic, how to make it better. And that can really help avoid litigation. We have taken part in this process before with some success, where we've objected to projects that we did not agree with the final decision, and then they changed part of the decision and it made it better, and we ended up not going to court. Now, when they do a categorical exclusion, the only option to try to get changes made to a project after a decision is made is to go to court. Nobody wants that. We certainly do not want that. That's our last resort option. We try to do everything we can to avoid litigation. It's not fun, it's very costly, and it's just a big time sink, and nobody wants to do that. So we're trying to avoid that here by getting the agency to agree to either drop this project and really reconsider what their priorities are, or to at the very least go through a more rigorous environmental assessment process, or even an environmental impact statement. But if they move forward with a categorical exclusion and they approve the project as is, one of our only options might be that we have to file a case against them, and we don't want to have to do that. So that's a big part of all of this, and it's really important to understand that. So I can talk more with the questions. If you guys have questions about NEPA and how the process works, happy to answer more questions about that later. But let's get into why then is the Forest Service proposing this? And I think we can look at a couple things that really have to do with the administration that we're dealing with right now. So in late 2018, Trump issued an executive order that was sort of this timber harvesting directive disguised as improving forest conditions and reducing wildfire risk. So you can see the title of this EO, this executive order, and it sounds nice, but when you actually read the order, it has this directive in there to the Forest Service to sell 3.8 billion board feet of timber in the process. And that is obviously problematic when you start tying these sort of commercial activities to ideas such as restoration or wildfire risk reduction. That can have some major ramifications down the road, which I will talk about here in a bit. Now, after that executive order, we've been able to get a hold of some memos, some internal agency memos that went around afterward. So this is from May of 2019. So this was about, I don't know how many months, yeah, maybe five or so months after that executive order. And you can see, this is the acting deputy chief of the Forest Service directing regional foresters and forest supervisors to really do whatever they can to push these types of projects through that have especially that have timber components to them, commercial timber sales to them. And they even said in this memo, I encourage you to explore creative methods. So, and this was really about using categorical exclusions as the first, that should be the first thing that they try to use, and they use them as much as possible and get creative with how they do it. And so that's where you might see something like justifying large tree removal by claiming that it has problems because of dwarf mistletoe. That is, in my opinion, a creative way to justify selling timber, and that's a problem. Now, there was another memo that was released the very next month. This is another really important thing here. So what this one did was it reduced the base price for when the Forest Service sells timber. It reduced the base price of what they call low value timber. It reduced it from $1 per 100 cubic feet down to 25 cents per 100 cubic feet. Now, in that memo, it defines low value timber as something that includes material that has a lengthy distance to market. So if you ever hear that there are no mills nearby the Los Padres, so they don't want to drive down here and get the logs, not only is that not really true, the nearest mill is not really that far away. It's just north of Bakersfield, and or it's south of Fresno somewhere. And those mills will often drive farther to get to sites in the Sierra than they will to come down major highways to get down into the Los Padres. It's a pretty easy shot to get straight to Pine Mountain. It's just a few highways to get down there, and it's quite accessible. But moreover, now this project, these types of projects where there's going to be, could be timber sales, and it could include this timber that is maybe farther away than some mills are used to. Of course, now they have a bigger incentive. You know, it's 4 times as valuable to come down here and remove this timber or to buy up this timber. So this is another big problem, and we're worried about how these directives are shaping these types of proposals. You know, of course, this project was proposed after these memos, after that executive order, and it's you know, something that we are thinking is tied to these administrative directives to the Forest Service. So given all of that, I think it's still good to address this concept of, well, maybe there are some ulterior motives here, but wouldn't, you know, reducing the density of these forests make them healthier? You know, that's what I think a lot of people, they'll have that question. And that's really what the forest is saying. They're not saying they're going to come up and clear cut the whole forest, but they are going to come up here and drastically reduce the number of trees. And they are claiming that this is going to make the forest healthier and reduce wildfire risk. So let's get into that and what the science is behind this. So here's what the Forest Service says about the area. So they say, citing personal communication with an agency scientist, not really citing papers or anything, you know, published studies or anything like that. But they say that on average in the area, there were only 65 trees per acre historically. And when I say historically, I mean the pre-modern fire suppression era. So really like pre-1940, you know, early 1900s and before. And it's compared to a range of 0 to 180 trees today, 180 trees per acre today. And they're saying that there's I think a little over 100 trees per acre on average in these areas. Now, we have not been able to see their stand data. We have requested this. So we don't actually have any way of verifying these numbers. We have not been able to get the historical data. We have a feeling we know exactly what source they're using. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that can be an issue. But yeah, so there's a lot of issues that we just don't know about how they came to these numbers. But let's look at some science that's been done on this. There have been a lot of studies that have tried to reconstruct what historical forest in our region looked like, how many trees there were, how dense they were, things like that. And this is a paper from 2017. And what these researchers found was that in the southern Sierra, in the Greenhorn Mountains, which actually have very similar dry ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forest as you might find here. Of course, there's going to be some differences and there is some variability between these, within these forests and between them. And remember, we have mostly Jeffrey pine here, but it's in fact, Jeffrey and ponderosa are so similar that Jeffrey pines used to be considered a subspecies of ponderosa pine. So that gives you an idea of just how similar they are. And what they found was on average, using old timber inventory data and old General Land Office survey data from the mid to late 1800s up into the early, like the 1910s, what they found was on average, there were about 171 trees per acre in the ponderosa pine areas, and there were about 202 trees per acre in the southern Sierra mixed conifer forest. So that's a lot of what we have here is, you know, these Jeffrey pine and mixed conifer forest. And the whole point here is that historically, these forests, they had areas that were very dense and they had areas that were very open. They were variable. They had a lot of landscape heterogeneity, which is very important for biodiversity. It's important for a lot of different reasons. And what we're finding is that even today, we're still seeing the same thing. And if you look at what the Forest Service is saying, the number of trees in the area is still well in that range of historical variability that is being found by researchers. So just on its face, you know, saying that there has to be this project to remove this, you know, a large amount of trees to get it back down to this historical density. Well, the Forest Service is not looking at all the science here that is saying, well, actually there were a lot more trees per acre historically than you're stating. And also, I just want to mention that if we have a good idea of what the historical data source is for what the Forest Service is saying. It's from 1930, and it's based on probably a couple of different survey plots, but there was only one plot in the whole project area from back in 1930. And it's really hard to draw inference from a single small plot in a big variable density forest. And so if that one small plot is in a relatively open area, it may give you a false impression of what that whole forest looked like on average. And so that can be really problematic. This study here was looking at a lot of different data sources from a lot of different survey plots and areas that were examined. So this really gets more at that variability, and that's why you see that there's quite a bit of density historically. So I can tell you all this and show you the science, and there's a lot more papers that we can cite to here, but instead I just want to show you some photos because I think that might be really helpful to see what these forests looked like back in the early 1900s. So let's take a trip to the past. I don't know if any of you were around in 1936. You very well maybe could have been. But this is what we have. We have some really cool photos from these vegetation type mapping projects that were being done by the Forest Service. And often they were taking photos of areas that were very dense that they didn't actually go in and measure. So they would measure the more open areas. That's where they would do their stand exams. But then you would see these photos of areas adjacent to those that were very dense. And, and of course, those don't show up in the data, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. So you can see up here on Big Pine Mountain. So this is the next, this is probably the closest, mountain type of mountain that we have to this area. This is just to the west of the Pine Mountain project area, across the 33, and you might be familiar with Big Pine Mountain. Really amazing area, and this is all from 1936, and you can see there was really dense patches of forest here. There's places where you have a lot of white fir, sugar pine, maybe some incense cedar, and Jeffrey pine, of course, all really close together, dense areas, and along with these hardwood, canyon live oaks and things like that. And again, this is 1936, so this is really before we really kicked into high gear on fire suppression. You can see the same thing here. A lot of conifers here, quite dense. And then here you get more into like a hardwood conifer mix, and still very dense here. And we can keep going. There are more photos. Of course, there is another area on Big Pine Mountain where you can see that the photographer is standing in this more open stand, which totally makes sense. We would of course expect that there were areas that were very open, but he's taking a photo of a very dense area that was mostly sugar pine. And so you can see how this can be a problem if this is where the plot data is recorded. This is where they actually do the survey work, but they don't do it out here. You can see how that can really skew what you might find from these historical data sets. Here's another area on the north slope of Big Pine Mountain. And on these north slopes, that's where you tend to have the highest density because these are more shaded, they have better moisture conditions. So you can see there's a lot of really nice mixture of conifers here, probably some big cone Douglas firs down here, definitely a lot of Jeffrey pine, sugar pine. You can see some Jeffrey pines way up here on the ridge. And then there's a lot of chaparral and hardwoods that sort of mix in with it. And of course, there are dead trees. I'm going to talk about dead trees later, but there were dead trees back then. This is not some modern phenomenon. Dead trees have always been a really important part of these forests. And we can keep going. We can look at Mount Pinos. This is an area that is mostly white fir, and you can see very dense white fir forest, probably on the north slope. This is from 1934. Here's 1938 near Alamo Mountain. So this would be to the east of Pine Mountain. And you can see there's some dense areas of Jeffrey pine here. And then there are, of course, some open areas too. You might look up on some of these slopes where they're a lot drier slopes, not quite the right moisture conditions. And you can see that they're a little bit more open. But down here, there's a lot, much higher density. And so the other thing to remember is that even today, when you go out into the Sespe Wilderness, this isn't the Sespe Wilderness, this is in an unmanaged area along Pine Mountain Ridge. There hasn't been any, vegetation removal or logging that we've been able to come across. And this is an area that also has not experienced fire in a very long time. And yet the forest has maintained this sort of open condition. This does happen, and you will find these areas still today where you have very open forest, but you also find areas that have more dense, forested areas. And so this is important. Again, it goes back to this landscape heterogeneity and variability, and that's a really important concept with all of this. So the next sort of logical step here is, well, maybe it's not going to make the forest healthier, but will it reduce the probability of catastrophic fire? And I want to get into fire and what makes fire catastrophic or not catastrophic. And I think it's important to remember that ecologically, in most cases, when you have what someone might consider catastrophic fire, it's usually not catastrophic in the way we think it is to the ecosystem. catastrophic fire is really about whether or not homes are burning. That's when fires are catastrophic. And I'm going to talk more about why this project is not going to help protect homes, but let's talk about the ecological side of all this. So here is an area that burned in the Rim Fire back in 2013 up by Yosemite. I know this is a different area, but it's a really good example of how this works. This is what we call a mixed severity fire. So everything you see burned as part of the Rim Fire, but you can tell there's some differences in how many trees died in some of these patches. So you can see over here, there's a lot of canopy retention here. Not many trees at all died. And this is what we know would have been a low severity fire that came through here. So this would be low severity effects. Severity just means how many, what was the mortality of the vegetation that you're dealing with from that fire. And so low severity, just very low mortality. This was probably a ground fire that came through, despite that this was a pretty dense forest. And you see that time and time again, studies have found that dense forests often do not burn at higher severity, which is contrary to what is expected by a lot of folks. And of course, they can burn at high severity. Any forest type and with any density can burn at high severity under the right conditions. That's usually driven by fire weather on a day-to-day basis, and then climate change on a more longer-term basis. But you can see here, there's more of a mixture. You can see all these brown, trees. These are trees that are in the process of dying. They got burnt up a little bit more. This is called moderate severity fire. So there's much more of a mix here. And then here you can see that there's very little canopy retention, and this is a patch that we would call high severity fire patch. And so this has created what you might call a snag forest. So there's going to be a lot of standing dead trees here. And all of this is normal for these types of forests. Mixed severity fire is the norm. It's what's been happening for millions of years in these forest types. And one of the reasons it's so important that there's mixed severity fire, not just one type of fire like low severity, is that this creates really incredible biodiversity on a landscape scale. So if I went into this area and I measured the number of species of birds, let's say, I might come up with 5 or 6 species of birds, and they're birds that really like unburned or low severity burned areas. And then I might go into this area and I find 6 birds that really like high severity fire areas, especially certain types of woodpeckers and mountain bluebirds, western bluebirds. They're all birds that really like these areas with a lot of dead trees. And then there's going to be some different types of species that will be in this moderate severity fire. And each one of these has their own set of diversity, and they may not have much overlap between the species that occur in each of these patches. But when you look at the landscape scale, that's called gamma diversity, that goes way up because you have these really, this patchiness between these different habitat types that get created because of these fires. So this is really important to landscape scale diversity, and it's an important process as part of these forests. So we know this, of course, from science. There have been study after study after study after study after study that have found that these mixed severity fires have been happening for a very long time, and they're crucial for biodiversity. Sometimes this is called pyrodiversity, and there's often a phrase that's pyroddiversity begets biodiversity. Now, of course, this is different in Chaparral and some other types of ecosystems, but in these types of conifer forests, for the most part, it's mixed severity fire is what we would expect to see. There's a whole book about this actually that really goes in depth on the ecological importance of mixed severity fire and all the science behind it. And just to give you an idea, like I was saying a minute ago, here's a really neat paper that found based on the type of fire severity, so these are in different patches, usually within a single fire, they would find that like hairy woodpeckers, for example, would be much more common in high severity fires, but ruby-crowned kinglets would be much more common in unburned areas. And so there are different bird species that really require different types of habitat, and that's again what makes this this sort of landscape scale variability with fire and density and things like that, makes it so important for diversity. And of course, we have plenty of evidence that high severity fire has been occurring for a long time, even well before we started doing intense fire suppression. Here's an area that burned in the early 30s on Big Pine Mountain. I showed you some of those photos from Big Pine Mountain earlier. And so you can see this is really high mortality here of these conifers. And so, this is a big high severity patch. This area eventually regrew really well, and then it burned again in the Zaka fire of 2007, and it burned at largely high severity again. And so this is part of the cycle, and it may be concerning when you see it, but once you start to understand the ecological role of these types of areas in this post-fire environment and how important they are for diversity, you'll start to see them very differently. And if you have questions about that, happy to answer those later. Here's an area in the San Bernardino Mountains. So this is all Jeffrey pine for the most part, and this is from 1926. I imagine that fire burned in either 26 or 25, and so these are some big Jeffrey pines got burnt up. You can see that this forest was pretty dense before the fire, and so this was a pretty big patch of high severity fire here, and most of the trees died. There's another area in El Dorado County up farther north in the Sierra. And you can see this is actually several years later. So this is 12 years after the high severity fire. And you can see that what's happening is a process known as forest succession. And so you have a lot of really cool chaparral species that are coming up, and they will provide temporary cover. This is sort of a temporary ecosystem that will take the place of the forest until the conifers, which you can actually see them already starting to regenerate, they will eventually grow up and shade these shrubs out, and you'll see these shrubs disappear on the landscape. But this is all a normal part of the process. But people have a tendency to look at this and think, oh, well, there's no more conifers. They all died, and all that there is shrubs now. And so that's a problem. But really, it's just you're looking at it at one point in time as part of the succession process that is very normal and very important for maintaining biodiversity at a spatial scale and a temporal scale. Now, when we talk about chaparral and our native shrublands, the natural fire regime is a little bit different. What we have there is almost exclusively high severity fire. This is what they are adapted to, and this is what is normal. We know from a variety of different evidence and scientific studies that these areas for centuries and millennia and likely millions of years have been experiencing large, intense, but infrequent fire, so once every 30 to 150 years. So you may see an area burn once a century, and that was really before we started just drastically increasing fire frequency from human-caused emissions, particularly in the modern era. And this fire regime is, again, it's high severity, but severity is not even really the right word here. It's really intensity here, because severity implies that a lot of things are dying and the landscape is drastically being altered. And while it is being altered on a very short time scale, a lot of the species actually aren't dying at all. They're able to resprout. Some species will die, but their seeds are actually germinated by high heat or smoke from that high severity fire. So this is all quite normal in these ecosystems. And this generally would have happened late in the summer through the fall, and would have usually happened under extreme winds. And that could have occurred after a lightning strike, hit an area and then it smoldered for a while, and then some extreme winds picked it up and turned it into a really large fire. Here is, just to give you an example of this, this is from the Cave Fire. This is a fire that happened back in November near Santa Barbara. And this was all really nice chaparral that hadn't burned in many, many decades. And you can see this is only 1 week after the fire. And so it looks very barren. This is the landscape. This is the photo that always scares people. They really don't like seeing this. It's very troubling, and it looks, people will say it's nuked, or they'll say it's a moonscape. And when I see this, I just see that this is exactly what it is supposed to look like after a fire. If it looks different than this, you actually are going to have ecological problems with how it regrows. And just look at the regrowth process in 6 months. I've been going up there weekly, just about, and you can see 3 months, you have really good resprouting of like wild cucumber. There's a lot of little seedlings, a lot of things that are stimulated. They only come up right after a fire. And then you can see here, 6 months later, we're still only in a very early phase of regrowth, but you have a lot of fire followers, a lot of morning glory. Most of the shrubs that are able to resprout, they've been able to resprout. There are countless seedlings in these areas. It's just an incredible, incredible scene, and this is exactly what it's supposed to look like. Anything other than this would not be good. If you don't see high severity fire in these areas, they will have trouble regrowing the right way. And you can see this has been happening for a long time. We know, we have photos from many of these types of fires in Chaparral back in the 30s, and you can see it leaves that same exact, that same look, these burnt stems and, barren landscape. But you can see even here, there's some nice regrowth starting, some seedlings coming up, and there's probably some resprouting that's happening here. And this is just a few months later. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because I want to point out an example of, back to Pine Mountain. I want to point to an example that we can actually look at for why the Forest Service is essentially claiming to attempt, claiming that they're going to be fixing a problem that really doesn't exist the way that they are saying it exists. So let's talk about the 2016 pine fire. So this is a fire that burned 1 mile east of the project area. It burned. You can see this is the ridge here. Haddock Mountain is like right here somewhere. I don't remember. I don't have it labeled here. If you're familiar with Haddock Camp or Haydock Camp, as it is technically supposed to be pronounced, fun historical fact for you folks who really like these old campgrounds. Along Bear Trap Creek. That's right in here somewhere. And so this was a 2,300 acre fire, and it burned mostly in a mixture of hardwood and chaparral and mixed conifer forest. And this burned back in 2016. And you can see that when we look at the data, the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity database, which the Forest Service contributes to, and this is what most scientists use to study fire severity, you can see that this fire burned predominantly at low to moderate severity. It was mostly low severity fire. It's all this sort of turquoise color you can see here. And there was only a smaller proportion that was high severity fire, only 16%. But when you really start to look even more closely at this data, you can find something even more interesting, which is that when we just take those high severity fire patches, so here's what I did. I took these high severity fire patches, delineated them from that data set I just showed you, and then used the Forest Service's land cover data set. It's actually called CalVeg, and it tells you all the different vegetation types that have been mapped in these areas and where they occur. And these were all done before the fire. So we know this is what it looked like before the fire. And you can see that most of what burned was hardwood. It was mostly that like low canyon live oak woodland that often mixes with chaparral. Most of it was montane chaparral up in this area. Very little of it was actually conifer forest. And when you actually look at this from the whole fire area perspective, what you see is that in terms of the conifer forest, especially the mixed conifer and the Jeffrey pine forest, only 4% of the mixed conifer forested area that was burned in the pine fire burned at high severity. So we have a great example of a fire burning right next to the project area. It was burning in an area that had not been managed. This is in the middle of the wilderness. It had the same variability in tree density, had the same levels of biomass and vegetation. It hadn't burned in many decades the same way as some of the project area. And yet it still mostly burned at low to moderate severity. And the mixed conifer forest mostly burned at low severity, with a little bit of moderate severity, and a very, very small fraction of them burned at high severity. And it created a really wonderful, mixed severity post-fire landscape that creates a lot of diversity on the landscape that is really good for biodiversity. And you can see here's one of the areas. This is more of a moderate severity fire area. This is about a year and a half after that burn. And you can see a lot of this really interesting species of buckwheat has really done well here. There's a lot of wildflowers here. You can't see all of it. There's a lot of cool native grasses that have come up in this area. And you can see some of the trees did die, of course, but you can see a lot of green growth still here in the back. This is another area where it was a much smaller high severity patch, and it was almost all white fir that was killed here. And you can see here, like one of these white firs actually, which looked like it was touching some of the white firs that burned up. It still didn't catch on fire. So there's a lot of different reasons for that, of course, and it can be very variable. And then, of course, in one of the high severity fire patches, this is about 2 years after the fire, there's already this natural conifer regeneration. These are sugar pine seedlings that are already coming up. There's a lot of, I think this is Monardella that's coming up, can't really see it. I don't know if it's bloomed at this point yet, but there's a lot of cool things happening here. There were a lot of seedlings in this area. So it is going to regenerate on its own. Climate change, of course, could slow it down or affect that, but generally what's going to be able to regenerate is going to be those species that are more well suited for warmer conditions under climate change. So this is usually when I get a question about dead or dying trees. What about them? How are they a problem? What about bark beetles and disease? I just want to make sure to remind you that this project is not about removing dead or dying trees. It is about removing any and all trees, just not all trees, but removing whether they're live or dead. And again, it's going to be mostly removing live trees just to try to really reduce that density very drastically and turn the forest into something that it's probably not supposed to be. And the Forest Service has already been doing a lot of cutting up there of dead or dying trees. They'll call it hazard tree removal, and the public never knows about that because they go through a different process where they don't even have to notify the public. So if that's what this project was about, we would not know about it. And again, they're already doing that in that area. They've done it for many, many years. So this is, again, not about removing dead or dying trees. Now, people are always worried that more dead trees, especially from bark beetles, are going to cause, wildfire risk to go up. But the science really consistently shows that bark beetle outbreaks are not changing wildfire risk. This was an area that looked at the whole Western United States, and they found that these large pine bark beetle outbreaks that we've been having have not increased the amount of acreage that has been burning throughout the Western United States. And there are, I should mention too, there are studies that have found that in some cases, even areas that are intensely hit by bark beetles, often years later, sometimes 20 years later, they will burn at lower severity than other areas that weren't impacted by the bark beetles. So that's really interesting. There's a lot of dynamics there. This is a more emerging field that's been being studied for the last maybe 2 decades, but there's a lot of science that goes into this, and just generally, these dead trees from bark beetle outbreaks have not been causing these massive increases in fire or making fire more severe as people often assume. And what's really interesting about this, there's a lot of really cool research that's coming out of the University of Montana, and these researchers are actually finding that the bark beetles may actually be helping forests adapt by removing trees that are specifically unsuited for growing during the time of climate change when they're having warmer conditions. So they were doing a lot of genetic testing of trees that survived and didn't survive in these big outbreak areas. And what they were seeing was that trees that grew up in the Little Ice Age under much more cooler conditions, they tended to be the ones that were killed by bark beetles. And that's because they just weren't prepared to deal with the really big drought that precedes these bark beetle outbreaks, and that is often driven by climate change. And so there's a really cool article, if you want to read it, it's on Mother Jones. If you look up Mother Jones and bark beetles, you'll find this where they actually they do a really in-depth interview with these researchers, and they talk about how we maybe should start looking at bark beetles less as a disturbance and more as an agent of adaptation in these forests, and they can really help them genetically, adapt to climate change, which is interesting. And of course, the Forest Service actually does know that dead and dying trees are important. Their scientists do for sure. This is party like it's 1999, way back in the day, right? I could keep doing 1999 jokes if you want. Everybody remember Y2K, stuff like that. I'm not going to keep doing that though. And I can't see your faces, but I hope at least one of you chuckled. I'm going to assume one of you smiled and laughed at my stupid jokes. But this is a cool publication from the Forest Service, and it's literally called "Dead and Dying Trees: Essential for Life in the Forest." And this whole article was actually about a bigger report that these scientists had done, where they were finding that basically the Forest Service policy, their management policies, had not been keeping up with what the scientists were finding in terms of how important dead and dying trees are for wildlife. And we still see that today, that the policy has just not caught up on the science, and the science is really clear about how important these dead trees are, and even the ones that are in the process of dying. And you can see here in the project area, this is a species that really likes snags or standing dead trees. This is a western wood pewee, and really cool species. If you go out here and just stand next to any snag anywhere in our forest around here, if you stand there long enough, you will see woodpeckers, you'll see wood pewees, you sometimes see like lazuli buntings. These species really like snags. They really like these dead trees. Even California condors, they actually prefer dead trees. They prefer snags for roosting and perching. And that has a lot to do with the fact that they can more easily land on them and take off from them. And so if you actually look at the research that's been done on California condors, it finds time and again that they really prefer these dead trees. And so they're a really important component to the landscape. And of course, when trees fall over, they are still really important as downed woody material, or as these logs that take a very long time to decay. And they are very, very important for small mammals, which of course attract hawks and other, bobcats and mountain lions and things like that. So all of this is very connected. All of these components of the ecosystem are really important to ensure that it's functioning in a healthy way. So sort of finally here, what will this project look like if it actually takes place? I want to show you an almost identical project from the Plumas National Forest. It used the same loopholes, the same categorical exclusions, the same language, roughly the same limitations on what can be removed, and in some ways actually was more limiting on what could occur on this project area. You can see there's a nice forest road here that's already established, and this is one of their treatment areas. This is what it looked like before that project was approved under one of these loopholes without, you know, an environmental assessment or anything. And this is what it looked like. It's actually, the project is still ongoing. You can see there's still some logs stacked up here. But here's the deal. This is not going to be a clear cut, but it is going to be a drastic reduction in trees, both big and small. And more, maybe even more importantly than the fact that trees will be removed, is how they're going to be removed. You can see all these little logging roads that get created. These are allowed under the way that these projects are worded. These are not going to be considered permanent roads. They're considered temporary roads. And so they're allowed to make these. And this is from all of that back and forth movement of all the heavy equipment, the feller bunchers, all of these things that are going in there and removing the trees. You know, it's usually not guys walking through very carefully selecting which little tiny trees they want to remove with chainsaws. That's usually not what's happening. It's a much more intensive process, and it leaves these very long lasting impacts on the landscape. This is going to cause major damage to soil and water for many decades to come, and it's going to cause issues with how understory plants are able to regrow and how these areas are going to be able to recover. So again, this is very similar to what it will probably look like on Pine Mountain. You can see there's a road just like Pine Mountain Road, and we'll likely see a lot of these little logging roads that will be created up there. Overall, it's going to be very impactful if they do it in this way. And you know, Chaparral, which is the other thing I'm really concerned about here, this is what it looks like when Chaparral is being masticated. This is in the Los Padres National Forest for a different fuel break that was created. And you can see this is a really intensive process as well. They take these big machines and just sort of grind all the shrub material down into mulch. I can't tell you how many different ways this causes problems, but a really big one is that it really makes it highly likely that the only thing that comes back after this is non-native invasive grasses that just make wildfire risk worse. So you can look at this, this is that same fuel break just in a different area. And this is after it gets created. You can see all that comes back are these invasive plants. This is mostly wild oats here. You can see it here in the foreground. So this is all this tan color is actually grasses that are not supposed to be there. They've dried out way earlier in the year compared to anything else. You know, you still have relatively moist conditions in the Chaparral here. You can see that it's an evergreen ecosystem. This is annual. It's producing a lot of what they might call fine fuel. This is where ignitions almost always start, and they spread into Chaparral. And so because it's along a road, just like the fuel break would be along Pine Mountain Road, your ignition potential goes way up. And this one especially is problematic because it's below some power lines. So you can see there's just all sorts of issues here. But this is generally what these big fuel breaks look like afterward. And you can see up on Pine Mountain Ridge in the Chaparral dominated areas, they've already been doing all this dozer work. Every time a fire breaks out anywhere nearby, whether it's miles away or not, usually somebody gets sent up there with a dozer, and it seems like every few years they run a line up here, and this causes a ton of problems, and it's already made it so that the landscape is primed with these invasive grasses. Here it's mostly cheatgrass, which is a non-native invasive annual grass that is one of the biggest factors for increasing wildfire risk in Southern California and in our region. And what they would do with this project if it went forward is that they would masticate these areas. They would really just expand this fire break that's been created. They would expand it into a full-blown fuel break, and mostly what would grow back is all this invasive cheatgrass. So a lot of problems here. I really can't stress that enough. And just so you know, the Forest Service has actually done an assessment of these potential and existing fuel breaks and prioritized them. And this one got a rank, this was prioritized at number 118 out of 163. So this is really low priority anyway. You know, it's not very important for what the Forest Service wants to accomplish with their fuel breaks. And I'll end with this. There have been some studies on this. This one was actually studying fuel breaks in the Los Padres and other Southern California National Forest. And they have a very, very simple quote that I always like to point out. Constructing fuel breaks in remote backcountry locations will do little to save homes during a wildfire. So make no mistake, this project, it is out in the middle of the backcountry. It's miles away from communities. It's not going to do anything, especially under wind-driven conditions, to protect communities, like Ojai or Ventacopa, Lockwood Valley, those types of places. So this is a major problem. This is a big, big project that's being done with little to no environmental review and very little public comment. And it's being done out in a place that the scientists are saying this is not going to do anything except for cause more damage. So if you are concerned and have not submitted a comment yet, I highly recommend that you do so. You can go to lpfw.org/pine. That is our easy way to submit comments online. And I know I took up a lot of time, but there's just so much information to cover, and I only really scratched the surface. So we'll take questions now. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram, or you can follow me on Instagram if you want to learn more about Chaparral. But again, lpfw.org/pine, that is where you need to go to submit comments. So if you want to start asking questions, Rebecca, I don't know, do we already have some questions in the question box?
Oh, we do. We can start with the first one. What is Chaparral?
Chaparral, that's a great question. That is, it's a native shrubland ecosystem. It's not one specific plant. It's actually an ecosystem that's full of a lot of different species, and it's mostly shrub dominated. So you see very few trees. You see some herbaceous plants. You'll see some shrubs that are, some smaller plants that are called subshrubs, but it's a very complex mixture of plants that grow. It's the dominant ecosystem in our region and in Southern California, and it's also the most prevalent ecosystem in terms of its distribution in California. And it's really, I would consider, the defining feature of California and this Mediterranean climate. Really, really fascinating ecosystem. I highly recommend that you, look up Chaparral. You can talk, go and check out our friends, the California Chaparral Institute. They have great information on their website. I post almost exclusively about Chaparral on my Instagram. You can learn about it there. So, what's our next question? Thank you for that.
There's a comment that says they will also cut down trees if the canopy or crowns are touching.
Yeah,
if you want to comment on that or not.
The Forest Service is sort of obsessed with this idea that they need to create this sort of like park-like forest structure where it's just very widely spaced trees. None of them are touching. I don't consider that much of a forest. I consider that a park, and it certainly would not characterize what would be what you would have found historically in these areas, which again would have been very variable in its density. And but this is just something. Again, this is mostly a sort of a guise in order to be able to push through something that will involve logging. And again, the Forest Service has confirmed that a commercial timber sale is on the table for this project. And so those types of things that they're proposing to do, usually it's just a way to really more easily get these projects sort of slipped in under the radar, tell the public that it's restoration and that they're making things better for wildfire. And then really it's, opening it up to loggers. That is a major problem.
So I was wondering about this too. Will dwarf mistletoe eventually kill the tree, or how does it permanently damage the tree?
It's a great question, and it can. Any parasite can eventually kill its host. It doesn't often. Sometimes it's really that it'll just weaken. It'll weaken the host. It can, it can do a lot of different things. And one of the reasons that it's so important for the ecosystem, especially if the ecosystem, this is sort of a logical issue too, is that I don't think fire suppression has actually been suppressing a lot of fires like in this area. When you actually look at the ignition frequency in this area from lightning strikes, there's really not many at all. We have very, very low lightning strike frequency, especially when you compare to more frequent fire forests like the Ponderosa pine forest of certain parts of Arizona. Even some areas in the Sierra have more lightning strikes than we do. It's very low density here. And so, but even if we did have really frequent fire and we were suppressing them all, one of the things that you would see is probably that dwarf mistletoe and some other diseases and insects would actually be helping sort of keep the ecosystem in balance. And so if they do eventually start causing mortality, that is exactly what fire would have been doing anyway. And so a lot of these things that we see, these processes, are actually the forest sort of self-correcting in a lot of ways. But again, I don't think we're too far off from the historic range of variability on a lot of this. And the dwarf mistletoe in this project area, it does not seem to be causing high levels of mortality. It seems to be pretty normal in how much it occurs there. So yeah, it's a great question.
Are we requesting an EIS or an EA?
So here's what we're requesting as an organization, and I encourage you as the public to consider this as well. We're requesting that because this is, the Forest Service has already said in previous documents that this is a low priority project, that it's not really close to communities, it's not going to help protect homes. And because the science is, they're not using the best available science on what actually is healthy forest in this region, or how it might impact wildfire behavior in the future. We're requesting that they spend their limited time and resources doing higher priority projects, things that are closer to communities. There are still projects that have been identified from other plans that, that are maybe fuel breaks that are directly adjacent to communities. When we're talking vegetation management, science is very consistently clear. If you want to protect homes, the best way to do that is to do, to do things to the home to make it more fire safe, but also to do some vegetation management within hundreds of feet of the home, not within, miles and miles away from the home. And so there are still things that they can be doing in that regard. So we're requesting that that they should consider dropping this project and reassess their priorities, especially considering that they do have limited time and resources. But if they're going to actually go through with this project, at the very minimum, they have to develop an environmental assessment. An environmental impact statement would actually be probably more appropriate in some ways, considering some of the resource values that are up there, but an EA at the very minimum, and that would at least set up a process where they have to analyze alternatives, they have to respond to comments, and it would set up an objection period. It would just be a more rigorous level of environmental review. Good question, thank you.
Can you say something about the inventory roadless area situation up there, and what kind of importance that is?
Right, so when I showed you that first map, one of those first maps where you see those proposed wilderness areas, a lot of that is actually based on what's called an inventoried roadless area. So there was a lot of work done to sort of delineate these areas in national forests that didn't have much in the way of roads or human activity, and those were called inventoried roadless areas. And most of our modern day wilderness proposals are based on those inventoried roadless areas. And so what you see is that there's a lot of overlap between the proposed SESP wilderness additions in the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, and there's a lot of overlap with the SESP Fraser inventoried roadless area. Now, the roadless rule does require, it prohibits that there be commercial logging in those areas, and it limits any timber removal to what they quote as generally small diameter timber. Now, we're in court over this actually on a different case in the Los Padres, the Takuya Ridge project, and the Forest Service is claiming that they're not breaking that rule, even though they are, they had proposed and approved a project that involved commercial removal of any size tree, and including in the roadless area. And so that is a major problem, and it's a major concern. This project would pretty drastically alter the character of the inventoried roadless area and those proposed wilderness additions in those areas where they overlap with the project. Thanks.
And they're pretty rare.
Yeah.
Will the recording be available to share?
Yes, I believe we have recorded. Yes, we have recorded all of this, all 150 gigabytes of it. Or no, I don't know. That's how many we have remaining. Yeah, so this is all recorded. I don't think I set it up right. I don't know if you'll be able to see my face or Rebecca's face during the recording, but you will see the presentation the whole time. Apologies, we can't quite figure out the technology. This is only our second webinar, by the way, that we've ever done. It's still very strange. I'm not used to it yet. I really like being in person and seeing people's faces and talking directly with people. So you can see that it's very strange. But we will make this available. We'll put it on our YouTube channel, and we will share that on social media, and we'll share it on our website as well. And we'll send it out in an email. The same with the questions. We're gonna save all the questions as well and try to either follow up with people directly or post all those questions and answers to our website as well.
You mentioned the Takuya Ridge and the Cuddy Valley projects. We don't have any further updates on the legal part of that we can share right now.
Yeah, we're so unfortunately on our Cuddy Valley case, the judge did not agree with us on the Cuddy Valley case, which was definitely our tougher case. And we are looking right now at our options in terms of appeals on that, and because we don't agree with the decision, obviously. The Takuya case is still in court. We haven't actually had our day in front of the judge yet. That won't be until August, so we won't know on that until probably late August or September.
Are there any indications the purpose is to open up the area for fracking?
Not that we can tell. I will say that there was, I was actually just talking with Rebecca about this earlier this morning. I found through some old newspaper articles that there was a well that was drilled just south of Reyes Peak, so just a few hundred meters down the slope there, and you can actually see it. There's a weird little old road that kind of goes down to it. It's not really much of a road anymore; it's more of a trail, but it goes down to. You can tell it's been something had happened there long ago. That was actually back in the 40s and 50s, and it was Standard Oil. They tried to do this drilling up there, and it was. Very costly and completely unsuccessful. They drilled like 10,000 feet and didn't find anything, and it became a really big joke in the newspaper record. So there was you can find all these articles where they were sort of making fun of Standard Oil and their boondoggle of trying to drill Reyes Peak. So yeah, kind of a crazy deal. But no, we don't think that this is in any way related to trying to increase fracking or drilling in that area. It's not good for drilling there that we know of. But I will say, of course, with this administration, we always have to be on our toes about all of these things. We never know what's going to come out next. But so it is a good point that you raised, but it's not something that we think is a problem just yet.
Would a court action possibly put this project on hold long enough to appeal to a new administration?
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. I will say that with a shift in administrations, there's a lot of what we call agency inertia. So there's a lot of things that this agency has been, or this administration has been building up. They've been trying to change the rules. They've been doing these executive orders, these memos. All these things are going to be hard to sort of dismantle with a new administration. So don't be surprised if there is a new administration next year even, and you don't see a huge change just yet. That takes time, and it can be problematic. I mean, we're still dealing with a lot of things that happened back in the George W. Bush administration, during a period where Congress was very much in favor of trying to find creative ways to increase logging on national forest. We're still dealing with the the fallout from that. But yes,
so why do you think?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But yes, litigation could, of course, put a hold on it. But we're hoping we can avoid litigation. Again, that's always a last resort for us. People, they often think that that's like the thing we want to do the most and that we make a lot of money from it. But I can assure you that is not the case. And it's a thing that I actually dread litigation. It puts my stomach in knots for like just months on end, and I don't like it. And it's very challenging to even go to court because judges are very deferential to these agencies, and they'll often just listen to whatever the agency says and say, yeah, that sounds good to us, even if we provide tons of testimony from scientists who say otherwise. It's very difficult to win these cases, and we certainly don't like going to court over these things. And I think the last time we were successful in court over this type of project was back in like 2016, and really it wasn't decided by a judge. We just agreed, the Forest Service agreed to drop the project, and we agreed to drop our lawsuit, and we paid our own attorney fees and things like that. And that was for another remote fuel break in Chaparral. So it doesn't happen often, and we certainly want to keep it that way.
What we win is the forest protection. We don't win money. So why is this project being proposed? Is it about making money?
Under this administration, that seems to be the directive, is that what we have been seeing, at least from a lobbying perspective, is the timber industry has been lobbying really, really hard in Congress. And I think they saw an opportunity with this administration to really get some changes made at the administrative level in these agencies. And what I mean by that is that if you go back to the 80s when we had sort of our peak in commercial logging on national forests, that was also when you see the public backlash sort of peak to commercial logging. That's when there was a lot of clear cutting going on in these forests. And what you see over the 90s and the early 2000s was really a rebranding of a lot of these logging practices in national forests. They started calling it restoration. They started calling it, thinning, selective logging, all these things that sounded good. Wildfire risk reduction. You'll notice that, we say habitat clearance, but you'll generally never hear the Forest Service say anything they're doing is habitat clearance, even though if you're masticating chaparral, that is all you're doing is clearing habitat, and it's not going to give you much benefit in terms of fire, risk reduction. So, rebranding these things has been really effective in making it so that they can slip these things under the radar. And now, because of what we're seeing with these internal memos, with these executive orders, this does seem to be about trying to revive logging in some of these national forests and to move it into Southern California national forests, where historically there has not been a lot of commercial logging at all, especially after national forests were created. So it does seem like this is all kind of part of a coordinated effort across the Western United States to drive up the amount of timber harvesting that's happening under the guise of restoration or wildfire risk reduction.
So when you say, remember when you had the slide about the board feet price reduction, can you, so what does that mean exactly? That means that the timber company would have to pay less money for the board feet that they get? Or?
Yeah, so if it's a direct timber sale, that's basically the Forest Service will cut the timber and then say, hey, come get it. You can buy it at this price, or they'll negotiate some sort of agreement and come up with a price. And one thing that has been happening, especially when they're looking, I mean, we're concerned that this memo, this internal memo, is really directed at places like Southern California, where they are farther away from a logging mill, a sawmill. And so a logging company may look at the cost benefit, you know, and they'll say, well, it's going to cost us more to drive all the way down. We're just not going to make a lot of money if we have to drive all the way down there and pick up the logs. But by reducing that base price and calling it low value timber, which is, again, it's just a classification for any timber. It can mean a lot of different things, but one of the ways it's classified is if it's timber that has a long distance from where it would be collected to where it would be you know, going to a mill. And so what a logging company would be looking at is, well, they just dropped the price from $1, you know, which doesn't seem like much, $1 to $0.25, but that's essentially quadrupling the value of the timber from an economic perspective in terms of that, and that can be the difference between making a project economically feasible or unfeasible for one of these companies, you know, to drive kind of a farther distance than they might normally. So that's one of the big concerns here, is that, you know, with memos like that, and there have been, you know, quotas that have been increased at the forest level and at the region level. There are quotas not just for timber removal, but also for chaparral removal and just all sorts of things. That it's all, a lot of it has to do with just trying to ensure that they retain budgets from year to year. And a lot of the budget has just been shifting more and more to this type of work at the expense of recreation and other, you know, important aspects of what the Forest Service is supposed to be doing. So yeah, that's, you know, it's a big concern, and we certainly don't like seeing timber targets and timber quotas and you know, those types of things tied in with restoration projects. That is a bad mix, especially when you involve a third party, you know, logging company. I don't know if I answered your question, but I just rambled quite a bit.
You answered the question.
Great.
How hopeful are we that we can really stop this on a legal basis? Because I'm ready to chain myself to a tree. We've had actually a lot of comments, a lot of people offering to chain themselves to trees. So.
Wow. Okay. Good to know. Don't forget the shrubs, guys. Don't forget the shrubs. The shrubs are important too. I always say, you know, you gotta have love for the shrubs. So. You know, I think that we would have a good legal case here. There are a lot of problems with this project from some different legal perspectives, and I can't really get into all of that because, again, we don't know what the final decision is going to be. If the Forest Service listens to the public, they will either drop the project or they will, you know, they'll come back and say, actually, we're going to prepare an environmental assessment. I wouldn't be super surprised if that happened. I would be surprised if that happened. But this project has gained a lot of attention. I mean, we've seen what, over 4,000 comments in opposition submitted already just in like a week. So, you know, I think the Forest Service is feeling some pressure here, and that's really important. That's the public keeping them accountable. But really a big part of all this is that there's a huge lack of transparency. We don't know exactly what they're going to end up doing, what they're going to end up deciding. They may come out with a decision that totally changes everything about what they've said they were going to do in their project description. That's unlikely, but it's of course possible. And then they'll say, hey, look, there was nothing to worry about to begin with, but there is something to worry about. I can assure you that, and it is all very concerning and troubling. So yeah, from a legal perspective, though, I do think we have some strong cases, you know, some strong points that we could put in a case. But again, we have no idea if litigation will be an option or not. We don't know what the process will end up looking like.
What can I do to help out? This is a great question.
I'm gonna let you take
For
that,
me.
Rebecca.
So you can make a comment. That's the most important thing. If you have time to personalize that comment, it's even better. So if you go to our alert, you can go into where the comment field is, and then you can write whatever, whatever your own personal concerns are. The Forest Service really likes to see what your own personal concerns are. The second thing you can do is share that alert with other people, share this presentation with other people so we can spread the word about the risks and help other people to make comments. So the more that they can hear from us, the more chance we have that we could get the project changed. And then once you take action, if you don't unsubscribe, you will be on our mailing list, so we can follow up with you about whatever further plans we have and how you can get engaged. If you have any talents, or if you have any projects or ideas that you want to share with us about things to do, you can go ahead and email me. People have been doing that all week. My email address is rebecca@lpfw.org. And I've had people that are filmmakers or artists, all kinds of legal legal help being offered right now. So if you want to help that in that way, that's great. Also, we have a donation page. If you have those sorts of resources, any amount helps. We're gonna, eventually, we have lots of scientific documents to prepare and things to go through, so that helps fund that. And if there's an eventual legal challenge, that will help with that as well. Anything else to add, Bryant?
No, you covered it. I'm actually just looking at, I am amazed at all the questions. Wow, I'm so sorry I took up so much time, and I know some of you have been leaving, but we still have over 100 people that are watching, and I'm willing to stay here as long as we need to keep answering questions. But there are a lot of really good questions here that I'm amazed at some of these are just really, really awesome. So, and I want to try to answer as many as we can. What do you think, Rebecca? How do we want to keep doing this?
I don't know. I can just keep asking and then see if I can see if there's any repetition and keep skimming down. There are a lot. We also will, copy all these down and provide answers in another forum and let you know
we'll
what
try
it
to
is.
send you directly to here. Let me actually, there's a couple that I can really quickly answer that I can just sort of blast through here. When could it actually begin at the soonest? Next spring. If they were to, we expect that they will issue a decision by the fall, and they really like to do this kind of work in the spring or in the fall. And so it would really depend on snow conditions and things like that. And yes, they would be coming off of Highway 33, going up Pine Mountain Ridge Road, but then they would be going off from the road from there with all their heavy equipment and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a good question. Good question, Christian. Thank you to everyone who said that this was a good presentation. Really appreciate the feedback. Always appreciate criticism too. If you guys have some things, I know I spend a lot of time talking about things that maybe are a little boring, but someone had a
There's
question
a question
about.
here
Oh,
about
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
other ecological consequences of the project besides the cheatgrass. If you had any words to say about that quickly.
Oh yes, there are tons of
The
ecological
biggest ones.
consequences. The biggest ones. I mean, I will just tell you from what we've seen with other types of these types of projects, there is always a cheatgrass explosion, or it's some other type of non-native plant explosion, and that's because there's no good way to mitigate that. And they will say that they're going to do mitigation. They'll say that they'll clean off their equipment before and after entering sites and stuff like that. And we have absolutely no idea how well they actually do any of that. But we do know that after they do this work, that because of all that ground disturbance, which you don't get quite the same way with a fire. If a fire were to come through, it's a completely different type of disturbance than when you have a bunch of heavy equipment driving through. And that's because a fire is not coming in and like stirring up all the soil or removing the topsoil or things like that. Even if it's a hot fire and it's penetrating pretty deeply, that's often killing any invasive seed that's already there. And so what this project does is it just creates these perfect soil beds for non-native seed, which is often windblown, to just easily move into the project area. That's a major concern. But the other big one is like when they're actually doing this project, again, there is no good time to go out and masticate chaparral. There's always bird activity in chaparral. When I was out there on Saturday, I just sat for like 20 minutes and watched a California gnatcatcher really do this really cool loop where it was just going from shrub to shrub to shrub, and it would come back to the same one, and it would go back, and every now and then it would catch something and would eat it, and somewhere it had a nest, and I couldn't quite figure it out. But that kind of stuff is always going on, and when you come in and masticate, that is just that is the most impactful thing you could possibly do to chaparral, is come in and masticate it. It's more impactful than any other thing I could possibly think of. So yeah, there are huge impacts. There's going to be impacts to wildlife and birds, and there's no level of mitigating that is going to make us, feel comfortable with how they're going to do it, especially if they're out there, using all this heavy equipment. There are other ways to do certain things that can, of course, really reduce those impacts. But and then again, I go back to, is this project necessary? And I don't think the science is in support of that idea. So yeah, good question about those impacts. And again, there's more on that I could keep talking about, but I think those are the big ones. What else we got?
There's a quick one here. Well, it might be quick. But is it in the EAs or EIS under NEPA, are there requirements for post-logging restoration that operators must follow?
So it depends on what you mean by restoration. So a lot of times with these temporary roads that get constructed from all the heavy equipment use, their restoration is that they will what's called decommission it. And all that means is that they'll put up some signs or maybe a fence, and they'll just tell people to stay off of it. That's it. That's the restoration. It's not like they're going out there and planting stuff, because again, the point is to actually remove vegetation. It's not to put vegetation back. They're not going to try to change the forest structure by removing and then planting things. That's not what they're doing. They're just simply removing plants from the area. So I think a lot of people have this idea that they're going to go up there and they're going to log it, and then they might be able to replant it. That's kind of contrary. That's not what the purpose is, which is even replanting it can have problems, because they may just be bringing in seedlings that have been grown in a nursery that is not the right genetic stock for what should be in the area. It may be not very well suited for climate change. There's all sorts of problems. They may not do it at the right mixture. So there are problems with that too, and we see that a lot with post-fire restoration, which is there's a lot of crazy things that are done after fires that really don't need to be done in a lot of places. So yeah, really with this project, they would be doing like what they call best management practices to mitigate it. But a lot of times mitigation is just, it's like, if someone cut off your arm and then said, we're going to mitigate that by not cutting off your other arm. It's not a great solution in the end. You're still causing a lot of damage. Like with this one, they'll say that there are like a dozen rare and sensitive plant species up there, and they'll say that they'll try to flag them, individuals in the population, and they'll do avoidance. So that would be like if somebody said, we're going to knock your home down, but we're going to leave your bedroom. Well, that's not a great situation for those individual plants, and it makes it much more likely that they're going to have trouble, persisting after the project gets done. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with the concept of mitigation or even restoration.
There's a couple of questions about Chumash. Let's see, how will local tribal representatives from the various bands of Chumash be consulted, or how have their concerns been overlooked in regard to the archaeological sites? What is the Chumash response to this proposed project? And is Los Padres Forest Watch coordinating with the native people of this area?
You want to answer that?
A lot of this, so we are working on all these things. We are coordinating with the local Chumash. We're either in contact or have tried to make contact with all the people that we know to contact, and then also asking if there are further contacts that we need to make. We have been told that there are some resources up there, and I guess the Forest Service, from what I understand from their process, they have a representative that's on staff, and they reach out to the federally recognized band, which is the San Ynez Valley Chumash, and
that's all they're legally required to do, is to consultation. Just means that they basically send a federally recognized tribe that's in the area a letter. But from what we gathered from our conversations with other state recognized tribes and other local groups, from the webinar that the Forest Service did last week, which was which is kind of full of all sorts of problems. But what we gathered was that those state recognized groups and some other local groups that aren't recognized had not been consulted with. They had not been reached out to yet. So, and the Forest Service doesn't, for whatever reason, that the law doesn't require that, and that's a huge problem. You know, they should absolutely be consulting with them. And the Forest Service knows that there are cultural sites up there because they actually have that. I mentioned that fuel break assessment. This, there was a document I mentioned toward the very end, and they actually say for this project, they say that there are cultural values within 300 or 1,000 feet of the project. So. Yeah, it's definitely, you know, that's a huge concern, and you know, that's a major concern for us too. You know, we tend to come at these from more like what is going to be the ecological damage, but we want to make sure we're working with the Chumash and trying to ensure that any sites that are up there aren't damaged. But again, it kind of goes back to that whole mitigation thing where maybe there will be some avoidance of sites, but if they're totally altering the nature of the area, you know, that's not great either. So yeah.
Somebody asked about a link to the project and providing that, and I've just put that in the chat. So this is the Forest Service the link to their project documents. And then there's another question that says, are there any local meetings to attend or politicians we can speak with to help stop this project, especially if the comments don't even need to be read or answered? So I know the Forest Service has been in discussion is hoping to have another public meeting. We hope that if they do that, that they'll answer all of the questions, not just the ones that they want to answer. And sure, you can get in touch with your local politicians. We might be providing some information about that to encourage them to advocate on behalf of Pine Mountain.
So I will say too about submitting comments. Yeah, they're not required to respond to them, which is very problematic, I know, but it does really help when we have the public, you know, sending in all these comments, because that can help us when if we have to go to court. That can really show a judge that there was a lot of public concern over this project, which is something that the Forest Service does have to consider about whether or not they need to be doing more rigorous environmental review. And so that can be an important thing, which would be showing that the agency is sort of ignoring the public concern or the controversial nature of the project. So I will say somebody asked just now about categorical exclusions and precedents and stuff like that. Let me just tell you how screwed up the categorical exclusion process is. The agency is actually allowed to make their own categorical exclusions. That's happening right now. It's a very much a fox guarding the henhouse type thing, where they're able to do what's called a proposed rule making, or like a rule change. And so that's them sort of deciding that they want to change the regulations that apply to them. And that's happening right now. There's a big proposal that is probably going to be finalized and released within the next couple of months, I would imagine, but it's already gone through this draft process. There was a comment period. We've already done a lot of work on this, but it would greatly expand a lot of these categorical exclusions and would make new ones. And some of them, like one of them was, it would allow like 11 square miles of vegetation removal, 6.5 of which could be commercial logging, as long as they called it all restoration. So that is a major, major problem. And so a lot of these categorical exclusions, they either got made by Congress, which there's a lot of controversy when that happens, or they're made by the agency themselves. So yeah, of course, there's a precedent that categorical exclusions were more intended to be for smaller actions that weren't going to have, that weren't reasonably going to have these big impacts, like painting a bathroom or something like that. But the process for making them has become so flawed and so broken. It's just, the agency is moving toward trying to basically not have to ever do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And that is a huge problem.
Let's see. Do you have a sample draft letter and/or studies we can quote? So on our action alert, there is some sample language in there that you can use. And then if you're an organization, we'll be sending around a letter as well.
Can there's a question about climate change that somebody asked. I believe Peter asked. I hope you're still on here, Peter. You said that there is a huge climate change component to all of this, and I totally agree. You know, you mentioned that this area is warming faster than anywhere else in the lower 48, and you asked about the importance of trees for cooling and carbon sequestration. So yeah, there's a lot here. I actually had a whole section on this for the presentation, but as you may have noticed, my presentation was already way too long anyway, so I had to cut that out. But I've talked about this in other presentations before. And basically there's a really important study that was done back in 2012 that looked at these types of projects. And what they were looking at was, can fuel reduction, that's what they call these, fuels reduction projects that include this type of logging and includes, you know, masticating shrubs and all that stuff. Can that change how much carbon gets released in a future fire? That was the idea. Like if they did this, will that make a future fire less severe, and therefore it would make there be less carbon emissions? But here's what the science kind of consistently finds. There's actually not a huge difference between what is emitted in a low severity fire and what's emitted in a high severity fire. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's because most of the carbon in a forest is in the trunks of trees and in the roots. And even in a high severity fire, those don't just vaporize. You can go into the highest severity fire patches in these forests afterward, and you'll see that it becomes what's called a snag forest. And so most of the carbon is actually still there, it's still retained. A lot of it gets converted to charcoal, and that actually is a form of carbon sequestration in and of itself. And everything else decays over very long periods of time. Now, for low severity fires and for high severity fires and moderate severity, most of the carbon that's emitted is coming from burning of pine needles, smaller plants, shrubs, herbaceous plants, you know, the needles on the trees, small branches, things like that. And that generally is always burning regardless of the severity of the fire. So what these researchers found was that when we do these types of fuel reduction projects, we tend to release on average, three times more carbon than would be saved in a future fire by altering fire behavior, right? And it's really questionable whether or not these even alter fire behavior in the first place. And what they were finding was that they would have to treat like 10 units of area to affect 1 unit of area in terms of carbon emissions. So all in all, these types of projects do not help with mitigating carbon emissions, and they just end up releasing a lot of carbon. And these projects almost always cause more mortality than would be caused in a future fire anyway. So that's a whole other aspect of this. And when you think about logging, when a tree dies in a forest, it stays up as a snag for a very long time. You know, that can be decades, especially the really big ones. They can be standing for several decades, and then they'll eventually fall over, and then they're on the ground for even longer. And that is a very slow release of carbon, and that is also helping put nutrients back in the soil, which can help more plants grow, which can then also take carbon in and sequester it. So when you do logging, though, you're cutting the tree. You're cutting the part where most of the carbon is, right, in the trunk of the tree. You're cutting that, and you're taking it to a sawmill. Most of that doesn't actually get turned into like, you know, wood. Only a small percentage of it actually gets converted into boards that can be used later, what you might call wood products. The rest of it is just like sawdust and other material that usually gets sent to like a biomass incinerator or just gets burned. That's a direct release of carbon to the atmosphere. And then that wood product that's made usually the carbon doesn't get stored in that for very long, especially depending on how the wood is used. And then of course, there's a whole other component to all of this, which is that there's a lot of misconceptions about, like I was kind of mentioning, about carbon emissions from fires. And there's a really cool paper from last year that they found that on average across the Western United States, the models that are usually used to estimate how much carbon is being emitted from fires are generally overestimating by like 100%, sometimes up to 200%, especially in California, because they assume that trees just vaporize in a fire when it's high severity. But when they were doing it, they were finding that the amount of carbon coming out of these forest fires is actually really low, especially when you compare it to fossil fuel emissions across the same time period in the same area. It's something like at most 5% of fossil fuel emissions, you know, across the same area and across the same time period. So yeah, there's a climate change component to all this, which is that this project is just going to release a lot of carbon and it's not going to prevent carbon from being released in the future if a fire comes through. So yeah, that's really important. And of course, the other thing is that there have been some studies that have looked into how these forests, when they have more trees, they can cool the forest floor. When you have more shrubs and understory plants, that can buffer wind movement, and all of that can actually reduce fire severity in a lot of cases. There have been some really interesting studies. There was one in 2014 that looked at the rim fire, and what they found was that counterintuitively, there were a lot of areas that they had been studying that had been basically had fuels reduction, either through frequent fire, return of frequent fire or something like that. And what they found was that it didn't matter what they had done in those areas. If the fire weather was high on that given day, the fire was moving through, you had a higher likelihood of high severity fire. And then they found that in areas that they expected high severity fire to occur, like areas that were really dense and had a lot of white fir and a lot of what they call ladder fuels, they often found that they were burning at low severity. So there's a lot that the science is not super clear on, and it's because it's very, very complex. But I really am glad you brought up the climate change component, because it is really important. And just remember that these kind of projects are being improved all across the country at a faster pace than they ever have before. And so you add all that up, and there's a huge climate change impact from just these types of projects that are getting pushed through without any sort of real, meaningful environmental review.
So someone here pointed out that I must have said congressmen and I didn't include congresswomen, and I can't believe I did that. So I'm very sorry about that. Of course, congressmen and congresswomen. And would calling one of them or senators be more effective than contacting the Forest Service itself? I think both are important. Again, yes, please contact your elected representative and urge them to your federal representative and urge them to advocate for the protection of this area. This is one of the arguments, someone says, this is one of the arguments that folks are using to try to prevent logging in the Tongass in Alaska. The same arguments.
And that's
Brian
the one
says
about
that
well, I can't tell what they were referring to. Was that about the nesting season issue, logging during nesting season? I couldn't tell. I'm sorry.
I don't know, I can't tell either.
I,
But we
I
do
can't.
see a lot of the arguments repeated across the different national forests, no matter what region they're in.
I usually do this in a presentation where I actually I've looked at some projects in Arkansas in the Ozarks, and they almost use identical language for their proposals, and it's like they definitely use the same type of language all across the Western United States, but they're even doing this out east and in the Ozarks, in places that have completely different forested ecosystems, and they say the exact same thing. They have the same targets, the same methods. They're saying they're just trying to make the forest healthier, and that they've got to get rid of a lot of trees to do that. It's bizarre. And so I usually have a part in my presentation where actually I'll show a comparison between two of these project proposals. It's pretty wild. So
I'm sure they haven't done market research. That would be wrong.
somebody said I posted a photo of Thermopsis on Pine Mountain. There's one Thermopsis that is it's a rare plant species. I don't think I have found that one yet. We are working with some botanists actually to do some rare plant surveys up there. The ones that I had been posting on, I don't know where you saw me post a photo of that. It was probably on our website or something, or maybe on Instagram or something like that. But that's just California golden banner. It's a pretty common species up there. It's a nitrogen fixer. If you go up there right now, you'll see a lot of it. It looks like lupins, but they have yellow flowers, and they have a different leaf structure that's more of like it's a 3 leaflet structure rather than that radial, hand-looking leaf structure. Anyway, that's up all over the place up there, and it's a great example of a plant that would be, heavily impacted by all that heavy equipment moving around along the ground. So, yeah. So thank you, Art, for mentioning that.
Here's a quick one. How long does it take for a 24-inch diameter tree to take to grow, or a 54-inch tree?
Okay, so I got a couple of cool
in
things
this area.
Here. Yeah, so it really depends on the growing conditions. There've been some studies on this, and it can be totally different. Like you can see trees that are the exact same size, but one is like 500 years old and one is only 200 years old. And it has to do with when they started growing. So a lot of trees that grew in the Little Ice Age, they grew really fast, and then they started slowing down dramatically. And then other trees that were able to handle warmer conditions later, they were able to grow a lot faster than those ones that had come up earlier. So there's a lot of confusion there. But I will just tell you this. I did some tree ring counts up there on some stumps. So because remember, the Forest Service has been cutting trees up there. They do it as hazard tree removal. You don't know about it. We don't ever get to find out about it because they don't do any environmental review for it. And we're not necessarily opposed to cutting down trees if they're like in a campground and could fall on somebody. But they often do it pretty far away from roads, and there's some issues there. But I was doing some counts, and I remember there was this one. It was less than 24 inches. I don't remember which species it was, but it was almost 100 years old. And I think it was about 20 inches. There was another tree, it was a 45-inch tree, and I got up to 200 rings before I couldn't really tell what the difference between a ring was, because if you actually look at a stump and do a ring count, you'll see that the rings get really, really, really tiny around the edges, and it's really hard to differentiate them. But I've been talking to some forest ecologists, and for like a 64-inch tree, for example, that could be, for a Jeffrey pine, that would be like, it could be 400 to 500 years old, which is sort of their like max lifespan. They don't usually get much older than that. White firs can get a lot older than that. And so I know there's been some work. There's one professor from UCSB who's doing some work up there, and he was looking at just trees that were less than 30 inches in diameter. He was looking at stumps, and he was finding all of them, they were between 300 years and up to 740 years old. So that white fir forest that I showed earlier, there are probably some 700-year-old trees in that forest, and they may not be as big as you might think, because it's just a different type of species. So yeah, these trees, even the ones that are considered small are going to be close to a century old in a lot of cases.
When can we expect the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act to go into effect? Will this project area that overlaps with will the project area that overlaps with the project area? I'm not sure I understand that. I'm probably reading it wrong, but the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act passed the House as part of a larger land bill, and now there's a bill in the Senate, and it's called the Public Lands Act, and it's S3288. And so we are, hoping that the Senate will take it up and maybe send it in a committee or something will happen with that. But we're working on pushing that through there, and it's probably quite likely that it's not going to move that much this year, but we'll look at that in the next year. Is there any kind of oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if Congress, sort of shifts and it's like, especially if the Senate were to change at this next election, it makes the likelihood of that passing go up quite a bit more. But I think that question was also getting at, like, if that were to pass, maybe would that help prevent some of this? And that all depends on the timing, yeah, because if it's in a wilderness area, that sort of is an automatic requirement to go through an environmental assessment process or environmental impact statement. And you'll actually see when you look at the project boundary, they drew it right along the boundary of the CESP, the CESP wilderness. So that was very intentional to try to avoid this whole, so that they could use a categorical exclusion. And yeah.
And 34% of this is in proposed wilderness areas.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, 34%. Yeah. Somebody asked about a spring. There's always impacts. There could be impacts to springs. They do have, I think, one like best management practice, which says something about they have to avoid. I think they can't do a whole lot of work within 100 feet of certain types of waterways. I have to go back and look at exactly what the language is on that. So sometimes they will avoid those types of areas, but there aren't many in the project area because it's on top of the ridge. You're right, there is a spring there's actually two springs. There's the Raspberry Spring on the north side, which is down from Reyes Peak Campground, and then there's the Choro Spring that's down toward Choro Grande Camp. But I think possibly both of those fall outside of the project boundary.
We do have some more, we're 48 minutes over. I feel kind of terrible about not adhering to our schedule here.
There's still 86 people watching us just kind of ramble away. This is cool. This is
Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. It's terrific.
That's always fun.
Appreciate your interest.
Yeah, and I wish we could maybe talk in person more, but wait, can Pine Mountain Ridge be included in the CESP Wilderness? Well, not the whole ridge, because it already has a road. It has there's already a lot of human impacts. So it itself couldn't be, but there are parts of Pine Mountain Ridge that are being proposed to be added to the CESP Wilderness. That's what the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act is about. So the whole ridge.
And that's really important. point to make is that, not any area can be wilderness, can be considered for wilderness. It's really these undisturbed by mechanical roads, logging roads, anything that's been, or industrial development. They call them untrammeled. Of course, people have been walking and using them for years and years and years and years and years. But they haven't been disturbed in a big way by mechanical means. And these are really rare areas, and the last of them need to be protected in southern and central California.
Yeah, especially places like this where we already have kind of a rarity of mixed conifer forest. You only really find it at these high elevation areas. So it's unfortunate to see these types of proposals, in these sort of what are already rare areas, be proposed under, this guise of restoration and without any environmental assessment or anything. So I don't know. I think we're not getting a lot of new questions in. Thank you for the kind words to all the folks who have said nice things about the presentation. And really, we can't do this without the public. Oh, somebody did ask, will this project then, if going forward, exclude it for future wilderness? That's a good question. I don't know. We'll have to think about that. That's a good question. So, and it's certainly a concern among our partner organizations who have been working on this legislation for a very long time. And yeah, somebody said something about inviting us to their site on 33. Yeah. Oh, and so you have a question about doing your own wildfire risk reduction on your own property. I would be happy to come out and talk with you about that. I think there are some really good ways that individuals can do things right around their home and on their property that are relatively low impact, and sometimes they're really low cost and will go a lot further in protecting your home than doing big fuel breaks and things. Yeah, someone else asked about our partner organization. So yeah, whoever, I believe your name is Wolf, we'll get in touch with you, or you can email me, Bryant.
I'm in touch with him already.
Oh, you are? Great. Okay, so cool.
Yeah.
We can get in touch. Would be happy to come and meet with you. And somebody asked about our partner organizations. We're working with, I don't even know, California Wilderness Coalition and the Wilderness Society.
Sierra Club.
Sierra Club, yeah. Just
National Parks.
A bunch of big
National
groups, actually. Yeah. A bunch of big groups that are working on all sorts of stuff. But we've actually been working on this possibly even before some of them got involved. We've been working on that wilderness legislation for over a decade now. So this has been a long
Cal Wild
thing. Yeah, that's why I said
Cal
California
Wild's
Wilderness Coalition. Yeah. Someone asked, can you speak to some of the increased die-offs of Southern Slope, Pine Mountain Ridge, Jeffrey Pine that seem to be increasing in the past 4 years? Oh yeah, so yeah, and you do mention that it could be anecdotal, and of course, we always have to be careful of anecdotal evidence and things like that. But I would just say right now that we're often seeing die-offs just from climate change, extended drought periods. That happens, and that's going to keep happening. And there's not a whole lot that can be done in some ways about that. But remember that if you're seeing some of those larger trees die, a lot of times those are trees that are really reaching that sort of upper end of their lifespan anyway. And so I want to just stress this, which is that forests are very dynamic, both spatially and temporally. So we're always ever just looking at it at one point in time. And sometimes we want it to stay exactly that way forever. And that's often what I think what the Forest Service is trying to do in some cases, where they're like, we've got to restore it to this like one point in time, what it looked like, even if the science behind that is questionable and the data behind it is questionable. But we just have to remember that ourselves, is that they are dynamic. They experience a lot of variability. They experience a lot of change over time. And that's how forests are supposed to be. And so it's one of the reasons it's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around mixed severity fire, because there will be variability with how fire affects a forest. So yeah, trees do die, but that is important. Remember that, I've talked to forest ecologists who will tell you, it's hard to really to say that a live tree is more important than a dead tree for a forest ecosystem. The dead trees are often just as important because of all of that really unique habitat that they provide for wildlife. And I've said this before. I mean, if you don't have death in the forest, your forest is not alive. And so just remember that. And of course, we want to always be mindful of if things seem like they're dying at really increased rates. But a lot of that has to do with climate change, and we have to address climate change to really address that at this more landscape level, like we want to do. So that's a great question, though. And yeah,
Even
sorry.
even after habitat, the tree continues to feed the forest. So after animals stop living in it, well, they don't really ever. I mean, it begins to
Yeah.
rot, and then other animals live in it, and then it feeds the forest. It becomes compost.
It's an important process. There have been some studies that have suggested that we actually, for a long time over the last several decades, we've had fewer dead trees than we did historically in our forest, which has maybe reduced forest health just in the fact that we haven't had as many dead trees. And that has a lot to do with, in some areas, trying to suppress fires and things like that. And so now we are seeing more dead trees in the forest, but it may actually be a return to what was normal historically. And again, I really recommend that if you go look up that publication about dead and dying trees being essential for life in the forest by the Forest Service, that's a great little publication. I think it's really cool, and it kind of will give you an idea. And that's from 1999. There's been a lot of work since then. There's a lot of different things you could read. But if you want to learn more about dead trees, happy to talk to you more about that one-on-one too. But I recommend next time you're out there, hang out by a snag or hang out by a log. Try to sit still and just wait. And I promise you will see a lot more life in those snags and those logs than you expected. So yeah. Yes, somebody asked about there being another logging project proposal for the south side of Mount Pinos adjacent to the Chumash Wilderness area. Yes, there isn't. We expect that. I don't know when that's going to be announced, but we've seen that on basically, there's a couple documents that we're able to look at with the Forest Service, and one of them is kind of a map that sort of says where they want to do potential projects, and that does show up on that, and it's going to be called like the McGill project or something. So if you're familiar with McGill Trail, that's where that would be, and it would be adjacent to the Cuddy Valley project. It would probably be identical to it. So yeah, we're concerned about that. We'll keep an eye on that. And again, this is now the third project in the last 2 years that have been proposed as something that could involve commercial logging and something that will be pushed through on these categorical exclusions. So there's been a shift in how this forest is being managed, in this regard, and that is certainly something to be concerned about. So yeah, thank you guys. I mean, seriously, really appreciate all the attention that the public has put on this, and we've been getting. This is easily the most. Rebecca, I mean, I think you're in the same boat as I am. I'm getting more emails and Instagram messages than I ever have before from people who really want to help out. So it's amazing to see the community come together on this, and we really appreciate it. We wish we could be with you in person. We're happy to keep doing these webinars and keep talking about this and keep updating people. But it has been, we don't always get this type of reaction, and sometimes we're fighting fights that are they're going a little bit more under the radar, and that's okay, and that's what we do. But I just really want to thank everyone for being so attentive to this and for spending all this time listening to us go on and on about all these things. So really appreciate it, and keep spreading the word. I think we're going to probably wrap it up because most people are kind of starting to head out now, it looks like, and though somebody asked about why more environmentalists can't sit on boards and be in agencies and stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of politics behind that, and I can't fully explain it all. I would love to be a part of some of these task force and things like that to try to really we have. I can't tell you that we haven't. We have, and we often, our concerns do not get addressed. They don't get listened to, and we're just we're put on there to sort of appease some requirement to have diverse groups on there, and it's unfortunate, but yeah.
But I don't believe the Forest Service has a board like this, do they?
No.
For this type of
This is
project.
all, yeah, this is all internal, but there are some things that maybe direct these types of projects at more localized levels. And there is, someone did just ask about if there being a bill or a law that we can propose to stop the Forest Service from being able to log. That's actually in the works. So there's a bill that is, I think, just there's a group looking for trying to find some people to sponsor it. and it would end the commercial logging program on the national forest. So that's good. So yeah, so be on the lookout for that. And the copy of the recording, yes, we will provide it. We're going to send an email to everyone who attended. We'll send an email with a link. Just give us a minute on this. It takes a little while to upload that to YouTube and stuff like that. So we'll send you a link, and we'll send you any other cool materials that we can think of. Some of the stuff I referenced today, I might throw in there into an email because you might be interested in reading it. I might send a couple of really cool articles that have been written about some of these topics. There's one that is like, to me, it's required reading about how forest and fires work, and it's just an amazing piece of scientific journalism. So we'll send that to you guys. And yeah, really, thank you so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and end the recording. I hope we have answered most of the questions that we can today. We will go back through and look at the question log and figure out if there was something that we just didn't answer. We'll try to follow up with people individually, and you can always reach out to us directly. You can email Rebecca at lpfw.org, or me, Bryant at lpfw.org. And again, you can follow us on Instagram, follow me on Instagram. Rebecca has an Instagram too, about her life out in the
It's private.
out in the boonies. Oh, okay. Mine's public, yeah. So.
You can.
Okay, so thanks everyone. We're gonna go ahead and end it, unless Rebecca, do you have anything you want to add?
No, just I really appreciate all the engagement and great questions.
Yeah.
And everybody's personal accountability for getting involved. It's terrific.
Yeah.
Gives us
Very
a lot
cool.
of hope.
Is the only way that we're able to really be effective is by getting the public involved. So so thank you. And yeah, we look forward to the next one, and we'll talk to you soon.